Chapter 3. Tuesday afternoon, Tina watched the final dress rehearsal of Magic. From a seat in the middle of the Golden Pyramid showroom. The theater was shaped like an enormous fan, spreading under a high dome ceiling. The room stepped down toward the stage in alternating wide and narrow galleries. On the wider levels, long dinner tables, covered with white linen, were set at right angles to the stage. Each narrow gallery consisted of a 3-foot wide aisle with a low railing on one side and a curving row of raised, plushly padded booths on the other side. The focus of all the seats was the immense stage, a marvel of the size required for a Las Vegas spectacular, more than half again as large as the largest stage on Broadway. It was so huge that a DC-9 airliner could be rolled onto it without using half the space available, a feat that had been accomplished as part of a production number on a similar stage at a hotel in Reno several years ago. A lavish use of blue velvet, dark leather, crystal chandeliers, and thick blue carpet, plus an excellent sense of dramatic lighting, gave the mammoth chamber some of the feeling of a cozy cabaret in spite of its size. Tina sat in one of the third-tier booths, nervously sipping ice water as she watched her show. The dress rehearsal ran without a problem. With 7 massive production numbers, 5 major variety acts, 42 girl dancers, 42 boy dancers, 15 showgirls, 2 boy singers, 2 girl singers, 1 temperamental, 47 crewmen and technicians, a 20-piece orchestra, 1 elephant, 1 lion, 2 black panthers, 6 golden retrievers, and 12 white doves. The logistics were mind-numbingly complicated, but a year of arduous labor was evident in the slick and faultless unfolding of the program. At the end, the cast and crew gathered on stage and applauded themselves, hugged and kissed one another. There was electricity in the air, a feeling of triumph, a nervous expectation of success. Joel Bandieri, Tina's co-producer, had watched the show from a booth in the first tier, the VIP row, where high rollers and other friends of the hotel would be seated every night of the run. As soon as the rehearsal ended, Joel sprang out of his seat, raced to the aisle, climbed the steps to the third tier, and hurried to Tina. "We did it!" Joel shouted as he approached her. "We made the damn thing work!" Tina slid out of her booth to meet him. "We got a hit, kid," Joel said, and he hugged her fiercely, planting a wet kiss on her cheek. She hugged him enthusiastically. "You think so? Really? Think? I know. A giant. That's what we've got. A real giant. A gargantua. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, thank you, thank you." "Me? What are you thanking me for?" "For giving me a chance to prove myself." "Hey, I did you no favors, kid. You worked your butt off. You earned every penny you're gonna make out of this baby, just like I knew you would. We're a great team. Anybody else tried to handle all this, they'd just end up with one goddamn big miscadence on their hands. But you and me, we made it into a hit. Joel was an odd little man, 5'4", slightly chubby but not fat, with curly brown hair that appeared to have frizzed and kinked in response to a jolt of electricity. His face, which was as broad and comic as that of a clown, could stretch into an endless series of rubbery expressions. He wore blue jeans, a cheap blue work shirt, and about $200,000 worth of rings. 6 rings bedecked each of his hands, some with diamonds, some with emeralds, one with a large ruby, one with an even larger opal. As always, he seemed to be high on something, bursting with energy. When he finally stopped hugging Tina, he could not stand still. He shifted from foot to foot as he talked about magic. Turned this way and that, gestured expansively with his quick, gem-speckled hands, virtually doing a jig. At 46, he was the most successful producer in Las Vegas, with 20 years of hit shows behind him. The words Joel Bandiere presence on a marquee were a guarantee of first-rate entertainment. He had plowed some of his substantial earnings into Las Vegas real estate, parts of 2 hotels, an automobile dealership, and a slot machine casino downtown. He was so rich that he could retire and live the rest of his life in the high style and splendor for which he had a taste. But Joel would never stop willingly. He loved his work. He would most likely die on the stage, in the middle of puzzling out a tricky production problem. He had seen Tina's work in some lounges around town, and he had surprised her when he'd offered her the chance to co-produce magic. At first, she hadn't been sure if she should take the job. She was aware of his reputation as a perfectionist who demanded superhuman efforts from his people. She was also worried about being responsible for a $10 million budget. Working with that kind of money wasn't merely a step up for her, it was a giant leap. Joel had convinced her that she'd have no difficulty matching his pace or meeting his standards, and that she was equal to the challenge. He helped her to discover new reserves of energy, new areas of competence in herself. He had become not just a valued business associate, but a good friend as well, a big brother. Now they seemed to have shaped a hit show together. As Tina stood in this beautiful theater, glancing down at the colorfully costumed people milling about on the stage, then looking at Joel's rubbery face, listening as her co-producer unblushingly raved about their handiwork, she was happier than she had been in a long time. If the audience at this evening's VIP premiere reacted enthusiastically, She might have to buy lead weights to keep herself from floating off the floor when she walked. 20 minutes later, at 3:45, she stepped onto the smooth cobblestones in front of the hotel's main entrance and handed her claim check to the valet parking attendant. While he went to fetch her Honda, she stood in the warm late afternoon sunshine, unable to stop grinning. She turned and looked back at the Golden Pyramid Hotel Casino. Her future was inextricably linked to that gaudy but undeniably impressive pile of concrete and steel. The heavy bronze and glass revolving doors glittered as they spun with a steady flow of people. Ramparts of pale pink stone stretched hundreds of feet on both sides of the entrance. Those walls were windowless and garishly decorated with giant stone coins, a gushing torrent of coins flooding from a stone cornucopia. Directly overhead, the ceiling of the immense porte-cochere was lined with hundreds of lights. None of the bulbs were burning now, but after nightfall, they would rain dazzling, golden luminosity upon the glossy cobblestones below. The pyramid had been built at a cost in excess of $400 million, and the owners had made certain that every last dime showed. Tina supposed that some people would say this hotel was gross, crass, tasteless, ugly, but she loved the place because it was here that she had been given her big chance. Thus far, the 30th of December had been a busy, noisy, exciting day at the pyramid. After the relative quiet of Christmas week, an uninterrupted stream of guests was pouring through the front doors. Advance bookings indicated a record New Year's holiday crowd for Las Vegas. The pyramid, with almost 3,000 rooms, was booked to capacity, as was every hotel in the city. At a few minutes past 11 o'clock, a secretary from San Diego put $5 in a slot machine and hit a jackpot worth $495,000. Word of that even reached backstage in the showroom. Shortly before noon, two high rollers from Dallas sat down at a blackjack table and, in 3 hours, lost $250,000. They were laughing and joking when they left the table to try another game. Carol Harrison, a cocktail waitress who was a friend of Tina's, had told her about the unlucky Texans a few minutes ago. Carol had been shiny-eyed and breathless because the high rollers had tipped her with green chips, as if they'd been winning instead of losing. For bringing them half a dozen drinks, she had collected $1,200. Sinatra was in town, at Caesar's Palace, perhaps for the last time, and even at 80 years of age, he generated more excitement in Vegas than any other famous name. Along the entire strip and in the less posh but nonetheless jammed casinos downtown, things were jumping, sparking. And in just 4 hours Magic would premiere. The valet brought Tina's car, and she tipped him. He said, "Break a leg tonight, Tina." God, I hope so. She was home by 4:15. She had 2.5 hours to fill before she had to leave for the hotel again. She didn't need that much time to shower, apply her makeup, and dress, so she decided to pack some of Danny's belongings. Now was the right time to begin the unpleasant chore. She was in such an excellent mood that she didn't think even the sight of his room would be able to bring her down, as it usually did. No use putting it off until Thursday, as she had planned. She had at least enough time to make a start, box up the boys' clothes, if nothing else. When she went into Danny's bedroom, she saw at once that the easel chalkboard had been knocked over again. She put it right. 2 words were printed on the slate, not dead. A chill swept down her back. Last night, after drinking the bourbon, had she come back here in some kind of fugue and number? She hadn't blacked out. She had not printed those words. She wasn't going crazy. She wasn't the sort of person who would snap over a thing like this. Not even a thing like this. She was tough. She had always prided herself on her toughness and her resiliency. Snatching up the felt eraser, she vigorously wiped the slate clean. Someone was playing a sick, nasty trick on her. Someone had come into the house while she was out and had printed those 2 words on the chalkboard again. Whoever it was, he wanted to rub her face in the tragedy that she was trying so hard to forget. The only other person who had a right to be in the house was the cleaning woman, Vivian Nettler. Vivian had been scheduled to work this afternoon, but she'd cancelled. Instead, she was coming in for a few hours this evening, while Tina was at the premiere. But even if Vivian had kept her scheduled appointment, she never would have written those words on the chalkboard. She was a sweet old woman, feisty and independent-minded, but not the type to play cruel pranks. For a moment Tina racked her mind, searching for someone to blame, and then a name occurred to her. It was the only possible suspect. Michael. Her ex-husband. There was no sign that anyone had broken into the house, no obvious evidence of forced entry, and Michael was the only other person with a key. She hadn't changed the locks after the divorce. Shattered by the loss of his son, Michael had been irrationally vicious with Tina for months after the funeral, accusing her of being responsible for Danny's death. She had given Danny permission to go on the field trip, and as far as Michael was concerned, that had been equivalent to driving the bus off the cliff. But Danny had wanted to go to the mountains more than anything else in the world. Besides, Mr. Jaberski, the scoutmaster, had taken other groups of scouts on winter survival hikes every year for 16 years, and no one had been even slightly injured. They didn't hike all the way into the true wilderness, just a reasonable distance off the beaten path, and they planned for every contingency. The experience was supposed to be good for a boy. Safe. Carefully managed. Everyone assured her there was no chance of trouble. She'd had no way of knowing that Jaberski's 17th trip would end in disaster, yet Michael blamed her. She'd thought he had regained his perspective during the last few months, but evidently not. She stared at the chalkboard, thought of the 2 words that had been printed there, and anger swelled in her. Michael was behaving like a spiteful child. Didn't he realize that her grief was as difficult to bear as his? What was he trying to prove? Furious, she went into the kitchen, picked up the telephone, and dialed Michael's number. After 5 rings, she realized that he was at work, and she hung up. In her mind the 2 words burned, white on black, "not dead." This evening she would call Michael, when she got home from the premiere and the party afterward. She was certain to be quite late, but she wasn't going to worry about waking him. She stood indecisively in the center of the small kitchen, trying to find the willpower to go to Danny's room and box his clothes, as she had planned. But she had lost her nerve. She couldn't go in there again. Not today. Maybe not for a few days. Damn Michael. In the refrigerator was a half-empty bottle of white wine. She poured a glassful and carried it into the master bath. She was drinking too much. Bourbon last night. Wine now. Until recently, she had rarely used alcohol to calm her nerves, but now it was her cure of first resort. Once she had gotten through the premiere of Magic, she had better start cutting back on the booze. Now she desperately needed it. She took a long shower. She let the hot water beat down on her neck for several minutes, until the stiffness in her muscles melted and flowed away. After the shower, the chilled wine further relaxed her body, although it did little to calm her mind and allay her anxiety. She kept thinking of the chalkboard. Not dead. Chapter 4. At 6:50, Tina was again backstage in the showroom. The place was relatively quiet, except for the muffled oceanic roar of the VIP crowd that waited in the main showroom, beyond the velvet curtains. 1,800 guests had been invited, Las Vegas movers and shakers, plus high rollers from out of town. More than 1,500 had returned their RSVP cards. Already, a platoon of wide-coated waiters, waitresses in crisp blue uniforms, and scurrying busboys had begun serving the dinners. The choice was filet mignon with béarnaise sauce or lobster and butter sauce, because Las Vegas was the one place in the United States where people at least temporarily set aside concerns about cholesterol. In the health-obsessed final decade of the century, eating fatty foods was widely regarded as a far more delicious, and more damning, sin than envy, sloth, thievery, and adultery. By 7:30, the backstage area was bustling. Technicians double-checked the motorized sets, the electrical connections, and the hydraulic pumps that raised and lowered portions of the stage. Stagehands counted and arranged props. Wardrobe women mended tears and sewed up unraveled hems that had been discovered at the last minute. Hairdressers and lighting technicians rushed about on urgent tasks. Male dancers, wearing black tuxedos for the opening number, stood tensely, an eye-pleasing collection of lean, handsome types. Dozens of beautiful dancers and showgirls were backstage too. Some wore satin and lace. Others wore velvet and rhinestones, or feathers or sequins or furs, and a few were topless. Many were still in the communal dressing rooms, while other girls, already costumed, waited in the halls or at the edge of the big stage, talking about children and husbands and boyfriends and recipes, as if they were secretaries on a coffee break and not some of the most beautiful women in the world. Tina wanted to stay in the wings throughout the performance, but she could do nothing more behind the curtains. Magic was now in the hands of the performers and technicians. 25 minutes before showtime, Tina left the stage and went into the noisy showroom. She headed toward the center booth in the VIP row, where Charles Mainway, general manager and principal stockholder of the Golden Pyramid Hotel, waited for her. She stopped first at the booth next to Mainway's. Joel Bandieri was with Eva, his wife of 8 years, and 2 of their friends. Eva was 29, 17 years younger than Joel, and at 5'8", she was also 4 inches taller than he was. She was an ex-showgirl, blonde, willowy, delicately beautiful. She gently squeezed Tina's hand. "Don't worry. You're too good to fail. We got a hit, kid," Joel assured Tina once more. In the next semicircular booth, Charles Mainway greeted Tina with a warm smile. Mainway carried and held himself as if he were an aristocrat, and his mane of silver hair and his clear blue eyes contributed to the image he wished to project. However, his features were large, square, and utterly without evidence of patrician blood, and even after the mellowing influences of elocution teachers, his naturally low, gravelly voice belied his origins in a rough Brooklyn neighborhood. As Tina slid into the booth beside Mainway, a tuxedoed captain appeared and filled her glass with Dom PS 233, Rignan. Helen Mainway, Charlie's wife, sat at his left side. Helen was by nature everything that poor Charlie struggled to be, impeccably well-mannered, sophisticated, graceful, at ease and confident in any situation. She was tall, slender, striking, 55 years old but able to pass for a well-preserved 40. Tina, my dear, I want you to meet a friend of ours, Helen said, indicating the fourth person in the booth. This is Elliot Stryker. Elliot, this lovely young lady is Christina Evans, the guiding hand behind Magic. One of two guiding hands, Tina said. Joel Bandieri is more responsible for the show than I am, especially if it's a flop. Stryker laughed. I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Evans. Just plain Tina, she said. And I'm just plain Elliot. He was a rugged, good-looking man, neither big nor small, about 40. His dark eyes were deeply set, quick, marked by intelligence and amusement. Elliot's my attorney, Charlie Mainway said. Oh, Tina said, I thought Harry Simpson. Harry's a hotel attorney. Elliot handles my private affairs. And handles them very well, Helen said. Tina, if you need an attorney, this is the best in Las Vegas. To Tina, Stryker said, but if it's flattery you need, and I'm sure you already get a lot of it, lovely as you are, no one in Vegas can flatter with more charm and style than Helen. You see what he just did? Helen asked Tina, clapping her hands with delight. In one sentence he managed to flatter you, flatter me, and impress all of us with his modesty. You see what a wonderful attorney he is? Imagine him arguing a point in court, Charlie said. A very smooth character indeed, Helen said. Stryker winked at Tina. Smooth as I might be, I'm no match for these two. They made pleasant small talk for the next 15 minutes, and none of it had to do with Magic. Tina was aware that they were trying to take her mind off the show, and she appreciated their effort. Of course no amount of amusing talk, no quantity of IC Dom PS 233 Rignan could render her unaware of the excitement that was building in the showroom as curtain time drew near. Minute by minute the cloud of cigarette smoke overhead thickened. Waitresses, waiters, and captains rushed back and forth to fill the drink orders before the show began. The roar of conversation grew louder as the sounds ticked away, and the quality of the roar became more frenetic, gayer, and more often punctuated with laughter. Somehow, even though her attention was partly on the mood of the crowd, partly on Helen and Charlie Mainway, Tina was nevertheless aware of Elliot Stryker's reaction to her. He made no great show of being more than ordinarily interested in her, but the attraction she held for him was evident in his eyes. Beneath his cordial, witty, slightly cool exterior, his secret response was that of a healthy male animal, and her awareness of it was more instinctual than intellectual, like a mare's response to the stallion's first faint stirrings of desire. At least a year and a half, maybe 2 years, had passed since a man had looked at her in quite that fashion. Or perhaps this was the first time in all those months that she had been aware of being the object of such interest. Fighting with Michael, coping with the shock of separation and divorce, grieving for Danny, and putting together the show with Joel Bandieri had filled her days and nights, so she'd had no chance to think of romance. Responding to the unspoken need in Elliot's eyes with a need of her own, she was suddenly warm. She thought, "My God, I've been letting myself dry up. How could I have forgotten this?" Now that she had spent more than a year grieving for her broken marriage and for her lost son, now that magic was almost behind her, she would have time to be a woman again. She would make time. Time for Elliot Stryker? She wasn't sure. No reason to be in a hurry to make up for lost pleasures. She shouldn't jump at the first man who wanted her. Surely, that wasn't the smart thing to do. On the other hand, he was handsome, and in his face was an appealing gentleness. She had to admit that he sparked the same feelings in her that she apparently inflamed in him. The evening was turning out to be even more interesting than she had expected. Chapter 5. Vivian Nettler parked her vintage 1955 Nash Rambler at the curb in front of the Evans house, being careful not to scrape the white walls. The car was immaculate, in better shape than most new cars these days. In a world of planned obsolescence, Vivian took pleasure in getting along, full use out of everything that she bought, whether it was a toaster or an automobile. She enjoyed making things last. She had lasted quite a while herself. She was 70, still in excellent health. A short sturdy woman with the sweet face of a Botticelli Madonna and the no-nonsense walk of an army sergeant. She got out of the car and, carrying a purse the size of a small suitcase, marched up the walk toward the house, angling away from the front door and past the garage. The sulphur yellow light from the street lamps failed to reach all the way across the lawn. Beside the front walkway and then along the side of the house, low-voltage landscape lighting revealed the path. Oleander bushes rustled in the breeze. Overhead, palm fronds scraped softly against one another. As Vivian reached the back of the house, the crescent moon slid out from behind one of the few thin clouds, like a scimitar being drawn from a scabbard, and the pale shadows of palms and melaleucas shivered on the lunar-silvered concrete patio. Vivian let herself in through the kitchen door. She'd been cleaning for Tina Evans for 2 years, and she had been entrusted with a key nearly that long. The house was silent except for the softly humming refrigerator. Vivian began work in the kitchen. She wiped the counters and the appliances, sponged off the slats of the leveler blinds, and mopped the Mexican tile floor. She did a first-rate job. She believed in the moral value of hard work, and she always gave her employers their money's worth. She usually worked during the day, not at night. This afternoon, however, she'd been playing a pair of lucky slot machines at the Mirage Hotel, and she hadn't wanted to walk away from them while they were paying off so generously. Some people for whom she cleaned house insisted that she keep regularly scheduled appointments, and they did a slow burn if she showed up more than a few minutes late. But Tina Evans was sympathetic. She knew how important the slot machines were to Vivian, and she wasn't upset if Vivian occasionally had to reschedule her visit. Vivian was a nickel duchess. That was the term by which casino employees still referred to local, elderly women whose social lives revolved around an obsessive interest in one-armed bandits, even though the nickel machines were pretty much ancient history. Nickel duchesses always played the cheap slot machines, nickels and dimes in the old days, now quarters, never the $1 or $5 slots. They pulled the handles for hours at a time, often making a $20 bill last a long afternoon. Their gaming philosophy was simple: it doesn't matter if you win or lose, as long as you stay in the game. With that attitude plus a few money management skills, they were able to hang on longer than most slot players who plunged at the dollar machines after getting nowhere with quarters. And because of their patience and perseverance, the duchesses won more jackpots than did the tide of tourists that ebbed and flowed around them. Even these days, when most machines could be played with electronically validated value cards, the nickel duchesses wore black gloves to keep their hands from becoming filthy. After hours of handling coins and pulling levers, they always sat on stools while they played, and they remembered to alternate hands when operating the machines in order not to strain the muscles of one arm, and they carried bottles of liniment just in case. The duchesses, who for the most part were widows and spinsters, often ate lunch and dinner together. They cheered one another on those rare occasions when one of them hit a really large jackpot, and when one of them died, the others went to the funeral en masse. Together they formed an odd but solid community, with a satisfying sense of belonging. In a country that worshipped youth, most elderly Americans devoutly desired to discover a place where they belonged, but unlike the duchesses, many of them never found it. Vivian had a daughter, a son-in-law, and 3 grandchildren in Sacramento. For 5 years, ever since her 65th birthday, they had been pressuring her to live with them. She loved them as much as life itself, and she knew they truly wanted her with them. They were not inviting her out of a misguided sense of guilt and obligation. Nevertheless, she didn't want to live in Sacramento. After several visits there, she had decided that it must be one of the dullest cities in the world. Vivian liked the action, noise, lights, and excitement of Las Vegas. Besides, living in Sacramento, she wouldn't be a nickel duchess any longer. She wouldn't be anyone special, she would be just another elderly lady, living with her daughter's family, playing grandma, marking time, waiting to die. A life like that would be intolerable. Vivian valued her independence more than anything else. She prayed that she would remain healthy enough to continue working and living on her own until, at last, her time came and all the little windows on the machine of life produced lemons. As she was mopping the last corner of the kitchen floor, as she was thinking about how dreary life would be without her friends and her slot machines, she heard a sound in another part of the house. Toward the front. The living room. She froze, listening. The refrigerator motor stopped running. A clock ticked softly. After a long silence, a brief clattering echoed through the house from another room, startling Vivian. Then silence again. She went to the drawer next to the sink and selected a long, sharp blade from an assortment of knives. She didn't even consider calling the police. If she phoned for them and then ran out of the house, they might not find an intruder when they came. They would think she was just a foolish old woman. Vivian Nettler refused to give anyone reason to think her a fool. Besides, for the past 21 years, ever since her Harry died, she had always taken care of herself. She had done a pretty damn good job of it too. She stepped out of the kitchen and found the light switch to the right of the doorway. The dining room was deserted. In the living room, she clicked on a stiffa lamp. No one was there. She was about to head for the den when she noticed something odd about 4 framed 8x10 photographs that were grouped on the wall above the sofa. This display had always contained 6 pictures, not just 4. But the fact that 2 were missing wasn't what drew Vivian's attention. All 4 of the remaining photos were swinging back and forth on the picture hooks that held them. No one was near them, yet suddenly 2 photos began to rattle violently against the wall, and then both flew off their mountings and clattered to the floor behind the beige, brushed corduroy sofa. This was the sound she had heard when she'd been in the kitchen, this clatter. What the hell? The remaining 2 photographs abruptly flung themselves off the wall. One dropped behind the sofa, and the other tumbled onto it. Vivian blinked in amazement, unable to understand what she had seen. An earthquake. But she hadn't felt the house move, the windows hadn't rattled. Any tremor too mild to be felt would also be too mild to tear the photographs from the wall. She went to the sofa and picked up the photo that had dropped onto the cushions. She knew it well. She had dusted it many times. It was a portrait of Danny Evans, as were the other 5 that usually hung around it. In this one, he was 10 or 11 years old, a sweet brown-haired boy with dark eyes and a lovely smile. Vivian wondered if there had been a nuclear test. Maybe that was what had shaken things up. The Nevada nuclear test site, where underground detonations were conducted several times a year, was less than 100 miles north of Las Vegas. Whenever the military exploded a high-yield weapon, the tall hotels swayed in Vegas, and every house in town shuddered a little. But, no, she was stuck in the past. The Cold War was over, and nuclear tests hadn't been conducted out in the desert for a long time. Besides, the house hadn't shuddered just a minute ago, only the photos had been affected. Puzzled, frowning thoughtfully, Vivian put down the knife, pulled one end of the sofa away from the wall, and collected the framed 8x10s that were on the floor behind it. There were 5 photographs in addition to the one that had dropped onto the sofa. 2 were responsible for the noises that had drawn her into the living room, and the other 3 were those that she had seen popping off the picture hooks. She put them back where they belonged, then slid the sofa into place. A burst of high-pitched electronic noise blared through the house. Vivian gasped, turned. She was still alone. Her first thought was, burglar alarm. But the Evans house didn't have an alarm system. Vivian winced as the shrill electronic squeal grew louder, a piercing oscillation. The nearby windows and the thick glass top of the coffee table were vibrating. She felt a sympathetic resonance in her teeth and bones. She wasn't able to identify the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from every corner of the house. What in the blue devil is going on here? She didn't bother picking up the knife, because she was sure the problem wasn't an intruder. It was something else, something weird. She crossed the room to the hallway that served the bedrooms, bathrooms, and den. She snapped on the light. The noise was louder in the corridor than it had been in the living room. The nerve-fraying sound bounced off the walls of the narrow passage, echoing and re-echoing. Vivian looked both ways, then moved to the right, toward the closed door at the end of the hall. Toward Danny's old room. The air was cooler in the hallway than it was in the rest of the house. At first Vivian thought that, she was imagining the change in temperature, but the closer she drew to the end of the corridor, the colder it got. By the time she reached the closed door, her skin was goose-pimpled, and her teeth were chattering. Step by step, her curiosity gave way to fear. Something was very wrong here. An ominous pressure seemed to compress the air around her. The wisest thing she could do would be to turn back, walk away from the door and out of the house. But she wasn't completely in control of herself. She felt a bit like a sleepwalker. In spite of her anxiety, a power she could sense, but which she could not define, drew her inexorably to Danny's room. Vivian reached for the doorknob but stopped before touching it, unable to believe what she was seeing. She blinked rapidly, closed her eyes, opened them again, but still the doorknob appeared to be sheathed in a thin, irregular jacket of ice. She finally touched it. Ice. Her skin almost stuck to the knob. She pulled her hand away and examined her damp fingers. Moisture had condensed on the metal and then had frozen. But how was that possible? How in the name of God could there be ice here, in a well-heated house and on a night when the outside temperature was at least 20 degrees above the freezing point? The electronic squeal began to warble faster, but it was no quieter, no less bone-penetrating than it had been. Stop, Vivian told herself. Get away from here. Get out as fast as you can. But she ignored her own advice. She pulled her blouse out of her slacks and used the tail to protect her hand from the icy metal doorknob. The knob turned, but the door wouldn't open. The intense cold had caused the wood to contract and warp. She put her shoulder against it, pushed gently, then harder, and finally the door swung inward,